Hi, hello, welcome y'all back to another reaction video. So let's react to the Samoan Dynasty. I keep getting tongue-tied. The Samoan Dynasty, Wrestling's Greatest Families, episode 1. So yeah, without further ado, we're about to hop straight into this video, so let's go.
World has been home to many famous families
I be trying to
throughout
talk
the years.
too fast.
Names like the Harts, the Von Erichs, the Rhodes, and of course the McMahons have done much to shape the industry, in fact. That said, aside from the latter of these, perhaps none have had a bigger overall impact than the Anoa'i family, as, since the early 1900s, they've been regularly producing some of wrestling's biggest stars. Yes, from Peter Maivia to the Wild Samoans, from Yokozuna to Rikishi, from The Rock to Roman Reigns, no one family has had such a consistent level of top performers come through their ranks. So join us today as we take a deep dive into their entire storied history in The Samoan Dynasty, Wrestling's Greatest Families, Episode 1. The lineage of the Anoa'is can be traced back to 1914, as it was then that their patriarch, Elder Reverend Amatuanawa'i Anoa'i, was born in the island of Western Samoa. And there, he would have a happy youth, devoting his time to his religion and eventually meeting and falling in love with Tavolo Leamanaya Leoso Ripley, the woman he would eventually get married to and have 13 children together with. Amongst these children would be Afa Amatuana'i and Liati Sika Amatuana'i, both of whom, while growing up on the island in the 40s and 50s, found an early love in the world of professional wrestling. Of course, part of the reason for this was that their uncle, Fanine Liafi Pita Maivia, had fostered this as he had his own dreams of becoming a wrestler, something he would eventually start doing in 1960 as he from there started going by the name of High Chief Peter Maivia. But why Maivia and not Anoa'i? Well, that was because technically Peter wasn't originally a member of the famed family. No, instead he'd been invited into it as a blood brother of the Amatuana'is, something which meant, going forward, his descendants would become part of the same lineage too. And as his career in the ring began to pick up, he moved away from Samoa so as to start working in both New Zealand and Australia, making a name for himself there as one of the stars of the Australasian territories, all while his wife, Olafia Fuatago, began working as a promoter herself, often booking his matches for him. So successful did they become, in fact, that after getting a small role in the James Bond film You Only Live Twice in 1967, where he would play a driver taking 007 to one of the villains' headquarters, Peter would get a chance to join his family over in America when, in 1970, he was booked with the WWF, the precursor to modern-day WWE, and there, he would spend the next 11 years wrestling the likes of superstar Billy Graham, Ivan Putski, and Bob Backlund. But while he was doing this, his nephews Afa and Sika were starting up their own careers, forming a tag team known as the Wild Samoans, while working primarily up north of the border for Stampede Wrestling. By 1980, though, they would also get their own shot with WWE, there having 3 impressive runs over the next 8 years that saw them, with Captain Lou Albano by their side, win the tag team titles on 3 separate occasions. But that wasn't all they were doing as, in between stints with the Fed, they'd journey as far and wide as New Japan Pro Wrestling, Georgia Championship Wrestling, and Mid-South Wrestling too, winning the Mid-South tag team titles 3 times in the latter, while in Georgia, they would become the NWA National Tag Team Champions, proving themselves to be one of the top units in the industry in the process. And they weren't the only Anoa'is reaching their peaks during the 80s, as it turned out, because while they were doing this, their cousin, Rocky Johnson, the son-in-law of Peter Maivia, was proving himself to be a formidable force himself, as by then, he'd spent almost 2 decades honing his craft all around North America, wrestling the likes of Classy Freddie Blassie, Terry Funk, Jerry Lawler, and Harley Race. But his relationship to the Anoa'i family wasn't always a guaranteed one because, after initially meeting his future wife Ata, the High Chief would not welcome him with open arms into the family as, knowing what the industry was like firsthand, he didn't want his daughter to be with a wrestler. In the end, though, after getting to know the Soul Man, he would give his blessing, and this would lead to continued success for Rocky, whose real name in actuality was Wade Bowles, who had taken his gimmick moniker from 2 of his boxing heroes, Rocky Marciano and Jack Johnson. Yes, initially, Rocky had wanted to be a boxer and had even trained in the sport as a youth, but with his path now well and truly rerouted towards wrestling, Rocky would finally get his shot with WWE in 1982, where after some early feuds against the likes of Don Morocco, Greg the Hammer Valentine, and Adrian Adonis, he'd have his most celebrated period when he began teaming up with Tony Atlas, as the duo would go on to defeat the Wild Samoans themselves for the tag team titles on December 10th, 1983. this making them the first ever black men to hold gold in the WWE. That's right, by now, the NOIEs were becoming such a force in the wrestling industry that they were beginning to cross paths with each other in the ring. Still, it wasn't as if there was any heat between the two parties after the title change happened, as Afa and Siko were only too happy to put their cousin
one on the
over
left is
and let
scaring
him
me.
go on his own run at the top. After all, what was good for the individual was good for the family. And this attitude would carry on into the next generation too, as by then, Sika and his wife Lisa had given birth to a child of their own, Matthew Tapanu'u, who was brought into the world in 1970. Following that, in 1985, he'd be joined by his brother Liati Joseph, but we'll get to them in a little while. Elsewhere, another of the children of Elder Reverend Amatuanai and Tovalomanaya, Afoa, had brought his own child into the world, and this child would be named Agatupu Rodney, or just Rodney to his friends, with him quickly falling in love with the wrestling business himself, as by the mid-80s, he'd start hitting the ring too. Initially, he'd work his way up the ranks in what remained of the territory system as the Great Kokina, but most friends nowadays will remember him better for his stint in WWE where, starting in 1992, he would be portrayed as Yokozuna, a feared sumo wrestler from Japan. And yes, Rodney was the furthest thing from Japanese, but that didn't really matter to 90s audiences because they bought into the whole thing anyway, something which allowed the big man to find huge levels of success and even become the first member of the family to win the WWE Heavyweight title at WrestleMania 9 on April 4th, 1993. Needless to say then, this was a major achievement for Yoko and his kin, and to make it that much sweeter, two of his cousins who were already on the roster at this point, Samuel Fred and Solofa, would be there to help him celebrate once the curtain had fallen that night and the fans had gone home. Of course, Samuel and Solofa, themselves being the children of Afa and Sika respectively, were by that point playing Samu and Fatu, the Head Shrinkers, a Savage Islander gimmick that was bringing them some success over the mid-card. And it wasn't anything new to them either, as prior to this, they'd portrayed a similar gimmick on the territory circuit, with this one being named the Samoan SWAT Team, one that would even briefly include their older brother Samuel Larry, more commonly known as the Tonga Kid. But the Tonga Kid was no stranger to WWE himself, as in the mid-80s, he'd worked there as part of a tag team with legendary tough guy Haku, teaming with him to form the Islanders. As time went on though, the Kid's relationship with Vince McMahon's New York company had ended, and from there, he'd moved on to working for the likes of the World Wrestling Council and World Championship Wrestling, running out the rest of his career there. That said, perhaps his most memorable moment culturally would come before this when in 1986, he got a small role in the cult classic Highlander, there portraying himself in a wrestling match being watched by the film's lead Connor McLeod at the start of the movie. Back in 90s WWE though, while another son of Afa, Lloyd, was making a name for himself over in Extreme Championship Wrestling as LA Smooth, the Head Shrinkers had started to build more success for themselves when they brought in the Wild Samoans' old manager Captain Lou Albano to be their mentor, with this helping to propel them towards tag team title success after they beat the Quebecers on April 26, 1994. Not long after that, though, the two brothers would go their separate ways after Samu left the company and began teaming with his cousin Matthew Tapanu'u so as to form the Samoan Gangster Party, a pairing that would take them to Extreme Championship Wrestling in 1996, where they feuded with the likes of the Gangstas, the Eliminators, and the Bruise Brothers. And after that ran its course, Samu would revive the Head Shrinkers gimmick on the Indies for a while too, this time teaming with LA Smooth, as he became known as Head Shrinker Alofa. Meanwhile, back in WWE, Fatu would eventually find success as a singles performer when he morphed into Rikishi Fatu, and later
Rikishi.
just
Always say his
Rikishi
name
in
so wrong.
1999,
Rikishi.
an ass-kicking, name-taking Samoan powerhouse who would become one of the highlights of the Attitude Era as part of Too Cool. Hell, at points, his signature move, the Stink Face, became one of the most over on the roster, and whenever he danced after a win, fans lapped it up in droves and cheered him on. But of course, he wasn't the most famous member of his...
You know, my question is, I always wonder, if I was to meet a wrestler, right, it would be Rikishi, and I always want to ask him, where did the stink face come from? And then my second question would be, the people who would get the stink face, do they get paid more? You know what I'm saying? Because that's a lot of ass. You have to cut the check, because like putting all that ass in somebody's face. Oof, Lord Jesus.
Family to appear in WWE at that time, as probably the biggest star of them all would have debuted just a couple of years earlier in 1996, and that was Dwayne Douglas Johnson. Yes, Dwayne, son of Rocky Johnson, would start out his career as a promising football player, but come the midpoint of the 90s, he decided to follow his family into the squared circle instead. And taking to the whole thing like a prodigy, he would quickly find huge levels of success as, while initially taking on the moniker of Rocky Maivia, a mixture of both his father's and grandfather's names, he would eventually morph
Whoa,
into
that
The Rock,
hair.
the most electrifying man in sports entertainment. And by the turn of the millennium, the only person who could challenge the mighty Steve Austin for the position of biggest star in wrestling. Of course, if you have even a passing interest in pop culture, you already know the history of The Rock though. An 8-time WWE champion, 2-time Intercontinental champion, 5-time Tag Team champion, 1-time Royal Rumble winner, 5-time WrestleMania main eventer, and probably the greatest promo in the history of the industry. At a certain point, in fact, he was so popular and overflowing with charisma that the squared circle could no longer hold him. That's why, in the early 2000s, he began branching out into Hollywood, first in bit roles on TV shows like Star Trek Voyager and That 70s Show, and then later in hit movies like the Fast and the Furious franchise and Moana, where he would, at one point, become the biggest box office draw in the entire movie industry. All while getting to give shoutouts to his family in the form of a cameo for his cousin Leati Joseph in Hobbs and Shaw, and the design of his character in the Disney animated hit being heavily based on his grandfather, Peter Maivia. And while he was doing this, he was getting other members of his family involved in the entertainment industry too, as his at-the-time wife, Danny Garcia, would start acting as a producer for most of his movies, while his cousin, Tanoa'i Reed, formerly known to American Gladiators fans as Toa, would work as his personal stunt double, with this being roles that both have continued to keep up to this day. So ubiquitous and successful has Dwayne become at this point that he almost dwarfs the rest of his family. And so important has he become to the Samoan people overall that, in July of 2004, he would be awarded the title of Siuli by Malitola Tanamufili II, one of Samoa's 4 paramount chiefs, with this being a notable honor that only the most privileged will ever receive in the island's culture. But that shouldn't detract from the rest of his family's achievements around this time too, because while he was dominating the dual worlds of wrestling and movies, his cousin Matthew Tapanu'u was finally getting his own shot in WWE as Rosie, one half of 3 Minute Warning. And this would see both him and his cousin Edward Smith, the brother of Rikishi and the Tonga Kid, find a lot of success in the mid-2000s tag team division as, with their powerhouse moveset, they were able to make short work of almost anyone they came up against, acting as enforcers to Raw general manager Eric Bischoff and beating the likes of the Dudley Boys and Billy and Chuck whenever called upon. But for as successful as 3 Minute Warning was, it would eventually run its course. And so, after that happened, both went their separate ways, with Edward, or Jamal as he had been known in WWE, spending the next couple of years working for Total Nonstop Action Wrestling and All Japan Pro Wrestling, while elsewhere, his cousin continued on with WWE as part of a comedy team with the Hurricane and Mighty Molly, there playing the role of the superhero in training, or SHIT, in case you didn't get the gag. Come 2005, though, with Jamal returning to WWE, it looked like a 3 Minute Warning reunion may be on the horizon. That was until Rosie would be fired from his contract around this time, leaving him to go over to Japan himself, while his former partner was rebranded as Umaga, the latest Island Savage gimmick from the mind of Vince McMahon that, while hugely outdated by this point, did manage to find some success, at one point having a notable feud with John Cena and even representing the Boss during the infamous Battle of the Billionaires at WrestleMania 23. By that point, though, he was one of the last remaining members of the family associated with WWE, as with Afa, Sika, and Rocky Johnson all long since retired, Peter Maivia and Yokozuna both sadly deceased, Rikishi and the Tonga Kid having moved over to the indie circuit, and The Rock having had all his time taken up with being the biggest movie star in the world, it felt like, for the first time in a long time, the Samoan dynasty of the Anoa'i family were notably missed in the world of wrestling. Luckily then, the next generation were waiting in the wings as, by 2007, Afa Anoa'i Jr., the younger brother of Samuel Fred and Lloyd and the son of Afa, would make his WWE debut as an early member of Randy Orton's group, The Legacy. And while he would never reach the same heights as some of the other members of his family, eventually getting booted from The Legacy and seeing his career stall afterwards, only a couple of years after he'd debuted, his cousins Joshua Samuel Fatu and Jonathan Solofa Fatu would follow. And of course, current WWE fans will know them as the far more successful Jay and Jimmy, the Usos, one of the most dominant forces in tag team wrestling over the last decade. But then this shouldn't have come as a surprise because, as the children of Rikishi, they would have the full benefit of their lineage, as starting in 2010, they began the run on top, never looking back from there as they made the tag team division their own in the wake of the TLC era. Meanwhile, as that was happening, another family prospect was picking up steam on the indie circuit as Lance Anoa'i, the son of Samu, had attracted the attention of many with his performances in the likes of the National Wrestling League, Maryland Championship Wrestling, and Tommy Dreamer's House of Hardcore. Simultaneously to that, and after having fully cemented himself as one of the most famous men on the planet, Dwayne Johnson decided to return to the world of wrestling when, on February 14, 2011, he was announced as the guest host of that year's WrestleMania 27, something which would serve as a precursor to him returning to action to face the likes of John Cena and CM Punk over the next couple of years, main eventing 2 WrestleManias while he was at it, and having one more run with the WWE title. And adamant that his family should continue to be a force in WWE going forward, he would help to get his cousin Savalina Fanine a foot in the door in 2014 as, from there, she reported to NXT, where she would be rebranded as Nia Jax. But while Nia may not have been the most naturally talented performer in the Anoa'i family tree, she was still able to get a spot on the main roster in 2016 regardless, right around the same time that the Usos were continuing to dominate the tag team division, as by then, another new member had been inducted into the family, as Jonathan Fatu had married fellow WWE superstar Trinity McRae, better known to fans as Naomi. So while the Usos would keep up their run of bangers against the likes of the New Day, Naomi and Nia Jax would rise up the women's division, with each eventually getting their own runs with the top prize, as in 2016, the latter would become SmackDown Women's Champion after beating Alexa Bliss, and in 2018, the former would become Raw Women's Champion after beating the very same woman. Meanwhile, around this point, Sean Maluta, the nephew of Afa, would also get a shot in WWE when he became part of the inaugural Cruiserweight Classic, with him from there moving over to NXT for a period as he tried to build a continued spot for himself. One person who was struggling to get a break with Vince McMahon's company, however, was Lance Anoa'i, as despite multiple tryouts and the family lineage behind him, the boss just never took to him as being a star he could do something with. This was why, in 2018, Lance would join Court Bauer's Major League Wrestling instead, soon being followed there by his cousin, son of the Tonga Kid himself, Jacob Fatu, as they would become 2 of the biggest stars in the promotion. But while for Lance this meant teaming with his father Samu as one half of the Samoan Island tribe, for Jacob it would mean singles success, as by July 6, 2019, he would have defeated Filthy Tom Lawler to become the MLW World Heavyweight Champion, a title he still holds at the time of this video's recording. And this makes him one of the most successful active members of his family currently then. That said, he's not the most successful because that honor would have to go to the tribal chief.
I didn't know he was Samoan. The tattoo should have gave it away though.
In recent years, Liati Joseph,
I didn't think about
brother
that.
of Rosie and younger son of Sika, has found huge levels of success as one of, if not the biggest star in modern day pro wrestling. And while it may have taken fans a while to get behind him, at this point, he's become such a big name that he's arguably the second biggest of his illustrious families behind The Rock. Already, in fact, he's a 3-time WWE champion, 2-time Universal champion, 1-time Intercontinental champion, 1-time United States champion, 1-time Tag Team champion, 1-time Royal Rumble winner, and 5-time WrestleMania main eventer, all before he's even turned 37 years old. Hell, at this rate, while he's unlikely to surpass his cousin Dwayne in the larger entertainment world, he might just end up surpassing him in the wrestling one as, in terms of accolades, he's already approaching Hulk Hogan, Steve Austin, and John Cena levels of success, something he's been able to do largely in tribute to his brother Rosie, who would die in 2017 of congestive heart failure. And with this reminding him of the importance of family then, Roman has been able to bring his cousins along for the ride of a lifetime with him too, as over the last couple of years, he's formed a stable with the Usos named The Bloodline. Where will he go from here? That remains to be seen, but with him acting as the top guy in WWE for the foreseeable future, while elsewhere his cousins are running the tag team division, their younger brother Solo Sikoa has started his career on NXT, and Naomi remains a major force in the women's division, it seems like the Anoa'i family is stronger than it's ever been before. At this point, most of the family are already WWE Hall of Famers, in fact, as, after the Wild Samoans were inducted in 2007, Peter Maivia and Rocky Johnson would follow in 2008, with Yokozuna being added to the ranks posthumously in 2012. and with the likes of Jacob Fatu and Lance Anoa'i dominating the indies as well, and The Rock's daughter Simone Johnson recently being signed to WWE as a future prospect in training.
Oh, she looks just like him.
No reason why the bloodline that's run so much of wrestling for so long now won't continue on forever.
She looks just
showing
like
the rest
him.
of the world just how they do it on the islands.
This was broken down
Well, guys,
so
what did you think
good.
of the
The
video? Let
timeline,
us
the
know
way
in
he
the
broke
comments
this down was
below.
really
Don't
good.
forget
I
to
did not
smash
know
the
that
like
he
button,
had I
subscribe
did
to
not
the
know there was like so much family in this business, especially like, you know, Samoan family. I did not know there was so many family members involved. That is so crazy. But it's gonna do it for this reaction, y'all. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave some likes and comments down below. Let me know what y'all think, and I will see you up in the next one. Bye.